get the. So we'll have an audio of each class as we always do. I do have to work on getting them up and available quicker. I have to figure that out still, but hopefully we'll get them up quick enough. And I'm also going to try and record, since we have video here, we may as well create a video of each class. So hopefully we can make that available as well. Okay. And as you all noted, probably noticed, Zoom requires that when you come to the class, that you go into a waiting room and then you have to be admitted. So hopefully you'll get used to that, and just know that it may take a minute or two until you get admitted. Okay, so it's really exciting to be back studying our Tanya. The schedule, it was not in the booklet, but the schedule is on the website. So if you go to the web page about the Tanya at jewishacademy.info, you will see the schedule there of the weeks that we're having it. So we're in the middle of chapter 19. And of course, chapter 19 is in the middle of a subject. So I'm going to do a little recap so that we are in context. And then we'll pick up where we're up to, which is section 3, which is called Chachma Awakened. This subject or context that we're in the middle of began at the beginning of chapter 18, where the Alter Rebbe teaches us a most fundamental concept. It's one of the key concepts of Tanya, and that is that when the Torah says that the matter referring to the Torah and the commandments are close to you, very close to you is what the Torah says, bificha uvelvavcha, in your mouth and in your heart, la'asosu, to do, which is really an expression of thought, speech, and action. It's making a statement that it's very close to every Jew to observe, to study Torah and observe mitzvahs. And the obvious question on that verse is, well, what makes you think it's so easy? I mean, there's a whole list of 613 commandments. That doesn't sound necessarily very easy. And the point that the Alter Rebbe starts explaining after building up everything we learned until chapter 18 is that in our root soul, in the root of our soul, which of course we are not necessarily conscious of, which is what creates the challenge, but still, potentially, our soul is deeply aligned with a deep, deep desire to be connected with God. That is what he refers to as the dormant love that is within the heart, the soul, I should say, of every single Jew. There isn't a single Jew that you will ever meet, even the most, we'll say, alienated Jew. And when I say alienated, I mean like a Jew who is a heretic and is an anti-Semite, if that makes any sense. You know, sometimes you have these unusually extreme Jews, which we probably and hopefully don't know personally, but we know of such people. Sometimes such people come up. Even such a Jew, by design of their divine Jewish soul, the essence of their soul has an inherent love for God, but it is dormant. It's dormant. That's the challenge. That is dormant, but it's there. See, if you don't have it in you, then you have to create it. Creating things is very difficult. But if you have it in you, you don't need to create it. You just need to discover it. And that exists within every single Jew, and therefore the Torah refers to it as being close to us. And that's why the Alter Rebbe, in the title page of the Tanya, he writes that this book is based on the verse that it is close to you, that the matter is very close to you, because this is what he's getting to. The whole 17 chapters are to take us to chapter number 18. And the reason why we all have this is because we inherit it from our forefathers, beginning with Abraham. Abraham chose and sort of lived up to a level of commitment to God and relationship with God, which was so wholesome and so deep and profound that God said, I am going to embed within your soul this nature, and this nature, which is like a spiritual nature, right? So we know there's nature and nurture with our children, and our children have a certain nature. They're born with a nature to them. And you can see that clearly amongst children. Children can be very different, even though they come from the same parents. They have very different natures, because that is part of their, you can say, their DNA. That's the way God made them. And this is true spiritually as well, that our spiritual souls have a nature. And that's why spiritually we are very different. Some people, their spiritual nature takes them towards an inclination towards one aspect of spirituality, others a different aspect. That's why some people are excited about one area of Judaism, other people are excited about another area of Judaism. It's just it's our spirit, and we, as the Tanya also explains elsewhere, that everyone has mitzvahs that their soul is attracted to. We call it a mitzvah dahabi zahir beit fei, a mitzvah that a particular person is very, very careful about, because it's very dear to them, it's very special to them. Some people are fantastic at being hospitable. Some people are fantastic at giving charity. Some people are fantastic at visiting the sick. Some people are fantastic at prayer. These are the things that their soul is naturally inclined towards. However, there's a common denominator amongst all Jewish souls, and that is that at our very root, we have this unbelievable, intense love for God, which is uncompromising, and nothing can get in its way. And why do we have that? We have that simply because we inherited it. So when you get an inheritance, right? So someone, God forbid, loses a parent, and they inherit from their parent whatever their parents have. Do they deserve it? Do they deserve it? Did they do something to earn it? No, not necessarily, right? They surely didn't do anything to earn it. Something happened and naturally it becomes theirs. Naturally, we all have this as a part of our being. And this actually explains a whole lot about Jews, because Jews are, I'm going to say this tongue in cheek, Jews are a peculiar people. So we do, we act up and we do funny things that sometimes defy logic, or we actually very often do things which are unbelievable, just completely unbelievable. You would never think someone would do this. Like, even if you just think about the idea of what the Jewish people did in modern history, 1948, to actually even fight the war of independence in Israel itself was a completely illogical thing to do, because they were vastly outnumbered without supplies. I'm not going to go into the details, which many of you I'm sure have read, but they did it because we have this part of us which is actually super irrational. It's just a deep drive that drives us because of that inherent connection to God that sometimes our mind is not even aware of. But being that it is who we are, therefore we do it. Or like the example I think I've shared in the past of a good friend who I used to, this is 1998, my first year I was commuting here, and I used to teach a class in his apartment in Doylestown, on State Street of Doylestown. There's a State Street in Doylestown too. The main State Street is in Newtown, but there's another one in Doylestown. And I used to teach a class in his apartment, and he was nice Jewish boy, married to a girl, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, Northern California girl. There is no, there was not a single, how can I say this? There wasn't a single cell in her body that indicated that she was Jewish, right? Her features, because she wasn't, okay? So, and I'm bringing this out for a reason. She today is actually, and they live in Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem. I think they may have moved out of Jerusalem. They live near Jerusalem. But at that time, he told me a fascinating story. Here, so the reason why I'm bringing this out is because here's a guy who, married a girl who did not share his faith, and yet when he was on campus in Northern California, where he met her, he told me that on Yom Kippur he would deliberately eat a bacon, a ham and cheese sandwich, to make sure it's milk and meat and bacon to boot, right? On Yom Kippur, just to show how meaningless his whole Hebrew school education is to him. That's where he was at. And he says one day he's walking on campus and he sees a guy who has a swastika like painted. He painted a swastika on his arm. And he says he has no idea what happened to him. But he flipped out, as we say in very profound English. And he ran over to the guy and he grabbed him by the shirt and started yelling at him. Because that swastika awakened within this guy who really was deliberately and consciously defying Judaism. And it awakened within him that essential part of our soul that a Jew can never get rid of. And usually it's extreme things that wake it up. This is what the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 18. And he explains something else also, which I'm going to review as well. And that is that what is this hidden love? Where does it originate from within our makeup? And so he explains that you may remember that the soul is comprised of, there's a soul, and the soul is comprised of, it's made up of 10 sephiros, 10 attributes. And the first of the 10 is Chachma, right? Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chachma. And as we explained many times in the past, Chachma is the first sphera of the person, and that is the connector between the person and God. How does that connect between the person and God? Because Chachma represents an aspect of our identity where we submit our identity towards a higher being, which in this case is God. That's what we're doing. We submit ourselves to God. That means submitting means that we are open to an awareness that there's something far greater than ourselves that is out there, and I have to get out of the way in order to be able to permit this to have a presence, which is a very profound thing to do. And that's why Chachma in Hebrew, which is made up of four letters, if you just play with those letters, you can split it into two-letter words, which are Koach Ma, the power of what? It's the ability to say, what is this? I don't know. Tell me, right? Give me insight. That's why in our Tanya, the practical Tanya, he translates Chachma as inquiry, where you're willing to inquire. When you inquire, you're seeking from another. It is the expression of non-self, the abnegation of self towards something else or someone else. It's like, very often when someone else wants to teach us something or tell us something, but we already know better, right? Or you can think about, which hopefully you're not having many of, but you can think about a political argument you're having with someone who's on the other side, right? And very often we're not open to hearing what they're saying. We just want to tell them the truth. But when we actually inquire, tell me more about that. I want to understand why you feel that way. That is putting ourselves to the side, forgetting about our viewpoint and actually being open to the other viewpoint. And that is expressed by Chachma. And that is the place in our soul where our inherent love for God lies. It lies right there, in that place, where we lose a sense of self and we're totally submitted to God. That is Ahava, that's love, complete love for God, where we're willing to even give ourselves up for God. So it's expressed by and represented by this level of chachma, and this level in our soul is a supra-rational level, even though it is part of Chabad, which Chabad is our intellectual faculties, but it's a part of Chabad, not where I understand, but where I'm willing to be taught from above myself. And so that's an expression of our intense love for God. So, and in chapter 19, which is the beginning of this chapter, the Alter Rebbe explains another very profound idea. And that is the idea of the verse that says, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the candle of God is the soul of man. The reason why our divine soul is, the analogy that is used for our divine soul is a candle, is because a candle, fascinatingly, the flame always jumps up to in a fashion that it appears as if the flame is trying to jump off the candle. And that is a representative of our soul, which is connected, grounded, just like the flame is grounded by, we know a flame is very, very, it's a spiritual entity, which is the reason why you can put your finger right through it. If you ever tried that as a kid, right? It's always really exciting. You can put your finger through a flame. It's something that is not really, it's space in this world, its presence in this world is very weak because it's spiritual. And that's why you can't grasp it, right? That's the uniqueness of a flame. And that flame is grounded it's grounded and held down in our physical world by staying attached to a wick, which is physical. That's something that you can touch. You cannot stick your finger through a wick. The wick will stop your finger. But the flame seems to try to constantly jump off of that wick, to sort of jump into the space of complete spirituality. And here's the thing: when a flame jumps off of the wick, what happens? It ceases to be. But the flame is willing to give itself up in order to be part of something which is more spiritual, which is more wholesome, which is more than just itself. And this is an analogy for the soul, because this is exactly the way our divine soul is. Our divine soul is willing to actually go do an act of self-sacrifice if it is something that God wants us to do for the sake of God, because that's his way of jumping towards God and saying, God, if this is what you want, I'm willing to give up my entire independent identity just to be connected to you. And that ability to do that comes from chachma. That comes from this aspect of our soul, which is open to our source as opposed to consumed with ourself. And this is really very, very practical, if it doesn't yet seem so, because one of the people in this world who are truly the most beautiful and powerful people are the people who dedicate themselves more and more. As I always say, it's a spectrum, so we're never perfect, but we dedicate ourselves more and more to the cause, to serving, to being there for another person. That is the most beautiful thing we can do. Bias, as we all know, is when we're not dedicated fully to what we're doing, we have a self-agenda involved. That always distorts what we're doing and weakens what we're doing because there's another agenda. So we're not giving our full self towards what we're doing, right? When we encounter selfless people who just drop everything they're doing in order to help another person, or they take on a cause for a community of people, and they dedicate themselves selflessly, sometimes with no benefit of their own. They're not making money off of it. They're not even getting honor for it. Sometimes people get vilified for it, for doing the good that they do. And usually that is the case, that if you take on something for a community of people, there will be people who will be the critics. That's almost always the case. but this person is dedicated. That there's nothing more beautiful than that. Why? Because it is not about self, it is selfless. And that all comes from Chachma. At extreme moments in the lives of Jews, which we should never experience, but at extreme moments of lives in Jews historically, we know millions and millions of Jews, not that every Jew always did this, but millions and millions of Jews have done it to demonstrate that there's something there. And that's the Alter Rebbe's point. They, even though they may have been completely ignorant about Judaism, or like my friend who I mentioned earlier, who completely was defying, he was in a mode of defying Judaism. But when something triggered, touched, provoked the essence of his soul, suddenly he forgot about all of that and he just rose to the occasion to express his deep, selfless dedication to God. That is chapter 18 and chapter 19. And just a moment. And he actually brings out, the Alter Rebbe brings out a very important point as well, which I want to review. And that is that holy, I repeat this very often because I think it gives us a point of very simple clarity. The definition of holy is something that is aligned with God. Klipa, as we've learned, klipa meaning a shell, is something that covers the fruit. It's something that covers, it hides God. When a person acts in a manner of chachma, in a manner of selflessness, they are acting on a very holy level because the only focus they have is God. Can't get holier than that. When we are not acting on a holy level, that is because we have self agenda mixed into whatever it is that we're doing. That takes away from the holiness. So sometimes we see that a person will act in a manner that that is super irrational. And we can look at them and say, this is crazy. Like, what are they doing? They're acting so ridiculous. And very often, that is actually an act of tremendous holiness. But we may be looking at it from a rational point of view. They are approaching whatever they're doing from a super irrational, chachma level point of view. And that is something that is very pure. And that's why he says, the tendency of klipa is to say, give me. Because klipa's focus is not on God, it covers God, its focus is on self. And that's the reason why klipa is associated with death. Because disassociation from the source of life, which is God, is a form of death. Just as we just read in the Torah last week, on Shabbos, that when God, what did God say is going to happen to Adam and Eve when they eat from the tree of knowledge? Most Thomas, you're going to die. Now we know that they didn't die, but actually what they did was they brought death to the world, because they would have lived eternally, and because they ate from the tree, they now associated with an element of lack of God, which is a disconnection from the source of life, and that ultimately brings to death. And if you want to know more about that, join us for our JLI course, which begins next Monday night. Just a little plug. So that's what we were learning until now. And we also, let me throw in one last thing, that he also says that this is the secret of God being in exile. What's the secret of God being in exile? That the mystical significance of God being in exile is that we have our divine soul, and when our divine soul does not have expression to divinity, because we so to speak, use it to give for life, to be able to live a life that's about self, that is actually is what puts God into exile. So that is all just the warm up to get to where we're up to. And I just want to say, if you have a question, the easiest thing that you can do is you can click the chat on the bottom of your screen. You should have a chat there, and you can type in the question, and I should see that. And that's the easiest way. While I'm speaking, if you want to just ask a question, you can do that. And at some point, maybe closer to the end of the class, we'll open up for any verbal questions if you'd like. So we're up to section number 3, which is on the bottom of page 225 in the Practical Tanya. So here we go. Having emphasized how the divine spark in the Chachma remains exiled and powerless in the sinners of Israel, the Tanya now stresses that it is never extinguished. Even though someone may live a life which gives no expression to their divine soul, that doesn't mean that their divine soul has died, because the divine soul actually never dies. It just means it's deeply exiled, but it's never extinguished. So he says, however, this exile of the soul's component of Chachma is only true of Chachma's, page 226, of Chachma's energizing influence on the rest of the soul. The fact that this profound connection to God, which is expressed by the Chachma level of our soul, may not show up in a person's life, doesn't mean that it in any way expired. It just means that it's dormant. But the root and core of the divine soul's component of Chachma remains untrapped in the brain. It's right there. It's always available. And does not actually become exiled and enmeshed in the sackcloth garment of Klipa in the heart's left chamber. It doesn't even become exiled, it's just not being expressed. So the exile of an entity implies that it is present in a certain location and yet stripped of its power and forced into activities against its will. Think about a prisoner. Someone's taken and thrown into prison. So they are an independent person, but they are stripped now of their ability to do what they want. Now they are forced to do different things. That's exile. The Tanya clarifies here that it's only Chachma's energizing influence that remains both present and powerless, exiled within the sinful part of the person, the left side of the heart. The root and core of Chachma, however, is located in the part of the body uncontaminated by Klipa, the seat of the divine soul in the brain. Therefore, it would not be correct to say that the root and core of the Chachma is exiled, since it's not present in a location of Klipa. It's merely dislocated from the rest of the person and unable to have any effect. So he's explaining, without getting too deeply into the nuances here, that the essence of Chachma is not having a means of expression. But beyond that, it is right there and it's always available. Rather, with Rishaim, with someone who lives a self-oriented life, it is as if the Chachma were asleep, failing to have an effect on them. It's simply like when someone's asleep. So it's asleep, and therefore it's not having an impact, but it doesn't mean it's not there. When someone's asleep, we don't say that the person is not alive. We just say the person's sleeping. They're in a certain level of unconsciousness. So in its home turf, the brain, Chachma remains in full force. It just doesn't have any significant effect beyond that, so it's effectively asleep. So if you're a very practical person, as many of us are, we will say, well, what help is that? Very nice that it's there, but it's not active. If you're a concrete person, you say, okay, bottom line, did you make money or lose money? Right? Or as we say, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? Right? But the reality is that's not all that matters. Because the fact that we have this aspect of our soul that is available and ready at any given moment, when it is provoked through, typically, an extreme experience, it's there and it actually acts. So as we learned in chapter 3, Chachma remains asleep in Rishayim so long as their das and Bina are preoccupied with worldly pleasures. So as long as a person's thinking, their thought level, and their emotional level is consumed by pleasure, by worldly pleasures, by mundane pleasures, then the Chachma sits quiet and dormant, because there's somewhat of a disconnect between the way the person is choosing to live their life and what their Chachma has to make available to them. But once their life starts to open up to what Chachma is associated with, which is the divine, suddenly we begin to experience this Chachma in our life. And we begin, actually, it's funny, very often, and I'm sure, I suspect every one of us probably had this experience, we find ourselves doing things we never thought we would do. And if someone were to ask us why we're doing it, we wouldn't really have a fully coherent intellectual explanation. That is all a part of Chachma, of this part of our soul which submits itself to the reality of the divine without having to understand it or rationalize it. So let's read the practical lessons in the sidebar. Only Chachma can be a channel for holiness because the other parts of the soul are too inherently self-serving. Your Chachma never becomes extinguished. It may become exiled and powerless due to repeated sinning, but it's always there waiting to be reawakened. Chachma is awakened, this is what we're going to learn now, Chachma is awakened by a test of faith, such as convert or die, which explains why so many otherwise non-observant Jews have chosen martyrdom for their faith. So, what he's saying is that the point I'm making that when the extreme situations very often reveal this level of our soul of Chachma, which we often don't see playing out on a day-to-day basis. And that's because when God tests us in an extreme way, that test provokes and awakens the Chachma level of our soul. And the proof of this, and this is the point he's making, is that we've seen many times that Jews who are not engaged in Judaism, when they are tested in an extreme way, their soul wakes up and they defy, even though they would never be able to explain why they're defying. It's like there's a story with one of the things that the Nazis did, which many of our enemies actually did. It's a very successful tactic, unfortunately. It started with the Egyptians, were the first people to do it. They used Jews against Jews. So this way, it creates a lot of confusion, especially when people are under oppression, to know who the real perpetrator is. So when the Nazis have Jews controlling Jews, then the Jews are fighting against each other, and they sort of get themselves out of the way, even though they're the real problem. So there was one command. I'm not even sure what they were. I don't remember what they were called. A capo in one of the camps, in one of the concentration camps. He was a Jew, but he was a cruel Jew. He was very cruel. And one day it was Yom Kippur, and there was a Jew that would not eat. And the Nazi saw that one of the Jews wasn't eating, and he wanted to force the Jew to eat on Yom Kippur, deliberately. So he told the capo, force him to eat. And this capo was known by the Jews to be just a cruel, he would beat his fellow Jews. He was just horrible. He would do anything to another Jew, as long as he was saving the skin on his back. When he told this capo to tell this other Jew to force this other Jew to eat, the capo shockingly defied the order, which is very dangerous because it puts his life at risk. And he said no. So the Nazi pulled out a gun, a revolver, put it towards this capo's head and said, force him to eat or I'm going to kill you. And this capo, who defied, he completely defied anything Jewish, as all of the inmates experienced from him. But in this instant, something woke him up. And a strong part of it was that it was Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, our neshama reaches a very heightened state. Whether we feel it or not, he felt it at that time. And it woke up his chachma, the chachma of his soul. And he said, I will not force him to eat. And the Nazi killed him. And he sacrificed his life sanctifying God's name. That's what he did. Our sages teach us that a person can acquire a portion in the world to come in one moment. That means a person can live a life which is a horrible life, and in one moment, if they can do genuine teshuvah, which is not an easy thing to do, don't rely on it. But there are isolated incidents where people have done this, and this guy is the one such example. And in some respect, he doesn't really get so much credit for it. I'm saying he doesn't deserve so much credit for it in some respect. Why? Because this was embedded within him. This is the way God designed him. He didn't do this consciously. He didn't make a decision, I'm going to give up my life. He just suddenly, this part of his soul was triggered and he became a defiant Jew. I will not force another Jew to eat on Yom Kippur. And I can assure you, he ate a fine breakfast that morning. The way he lived his life. That is the power. This is an exact example of, so if we were to take this man into a psychologist to understand the inner dynamics of this person, what would they explain to us? The point is that it comes from something which is super rational and therefore it can't be explained. And so now he's going to go into this idea of being tested, and we're going to understand this, how profound. It's going to give us a perspective that we can have, which is a choice we need to make, because whenever we're tested, obviously it's never pleasant. A test, the fact if we're getting tested by God, that's not a lot of fun. But the reality is that every test that God gives us is to bring out and reveal a deeper part of us. And when we are tested, it is an opportunity for us to be able to now reveal a deeper part of our soul. And very often that is the chachma of our soul. So let's go to the bottom of 226. So as we learned in chapter 3, for an idea to give rise to an emotion, 3 mental processes are required. Chachma, Bina, and Das. You have to inquire, like you have to say, hey, I have to inquire to understand. Cognition, I have to understand, then once I inquire and I get some notion of an idea, I then need to understand it. And then Das, recognition. Recognition is when my entire being recognizes this. It's not just that I understand it, but it is familiar to me. I know exactly what it is. The same way a person recognizes fire, and we have an emotional reaction to fire, where we step back from it, that's recognizing something. So even in the case of a wicked person, of Rishon, the root and core of their chachma remains pure and intact. But chachma fails to influence the heart because Bina and Das have been contaminated with an obsession for physical gratification. Even though my chachma sees the divine, it cannot trickle down into my day-to-day concrete conscious living if my Bina and my Das, my thoughts, are always engaged in physical gratification, which is a contradiction to spiritual or divine connection. So that's an obstacle. So I have this chachma, this very powerful connection to God, but it remains dormant. It doesn't have a means of expression in my conscious practical life. But when Rishonim are confronted with a test of life and death in a matter of faith, which transcends any logical considerations of Das, that test touches the soul directly, reaching its component of chachma. Such a test, where a person is told that you will be killed unless you defy or contradict your connection to God, even though this person may have lived an entire life which was self-absorbed and all about their own gratification. In that moment, that test awakens within him his dormant connection to God, and the person gives up their, and the Jew gives up their life. In day-to-day life, the klipa contaminated powers of Bina and Das successfully offer all sorts of rationalizations to Risham as to why they ought to indulge in sinful behavior, effectively blocking Chachma from doing its work. But when it comes to an overt test of faith, which is clearly not a rational decision applicable to Bina or Das, these cognitive powers are bypassed and the decision rips directly through to Chachma. See, if someone was rational, and a rational thought thinks like this: let me bow down to this cross, because after I bow down to it, it's just an act, I don't really mean it, and then I'll be able to serve God for many more years. What's the point of me giving up my life and then not being able to continue to serve God? That's a rationalization. Even though I know that God told me that one must give up their life rather than bow to an idol. So that would be a rationalization to rationalize why I should not bow down. But in such a moment where it's a blatant denial of God, which at least in action, what happens, the person's chachma is triggered, and it overrides the person's cognitive consciousness, and they suddenly do something which is completely super rational. Then the chachma awakens from its sleep and does its work of arousing faith. And what is faith? Faith is super irrational. That's what faith is. Using the power of God invested in it, as the verse states, then God awoke as one asleep. The power of God within the soul was aroused. And this enables a person to succeed in a test of faith in God without using any of his reasoning, any of his knowledge or fathomable intellect, to prevail over the klipos and these worldly temptations to which he had been accustomed, whether they be permitted or prohibited, and even to despise them, realizing how they separate him from God. This level of operation lets a person also prevail over worldly temptations, which are not only forbidden temptations, but even permissible temptations. Think about it this way. If I'm trying to think of an example. If I am able to have the thought that by me indulging right now in some selfish desire, which is not prohibited, it's a permissible thing, right? There's nothing wrong with doing it, other than the fact that in spirit, it is a self-indulgent thing, right? And I remind myself consciously that every time I do something like this, I am strengthening my self-oriented muscle. And when I strengthen my self-oriented muscle, I become an uglier person, because I am not dedicated to my loved ones as much, because I become more self-oriented. Even though we're talking about one act, which is just a minutia of all of the things we do. So its impact on us is relatively small as one act of its own. But still, it is reinforcing something. Now, if someone's able to have that thought, so therefore they say, I'm not going to do an act which is self-oriented. That actually is getting a person to operate on a much higher level. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, that in addition to extreme situations where God tests us, every small test God is giving us, we have the ability to override all of the rationalizations that our mind has. Right? Like every time we eat something that is permissible, it's kosher, it's got the OU on it, right? It's kosher ice cream. But I know that for whatever reason, it's not good for me and doesn't bring out the best of me. And then I don't feel good about myself. And then I imagine that I just gained 10 pounds from one scoop of ice cream. And all these other things that happen to us when we do things that a part of us doesn't want to do. And we're able to process in our minds all of the damage of this. And so then we overcome it. So sometimes we almost act in a super rational manner, where all the rationalization, come on, it's just one scoop. We don't go out so often. Once you're out, just live it up and enjoy it. All of the rationalizations that we have, and we override that. That's jumping into a super rationalization, going beyond our rationalization. And that can be, if it's done properly, that can be something which is very powerful. And that's the idea of chachma. So and it can actually lead to, and this is really more of a tzaddik level, but it can actually lead to a point where a person despises the pursuit of self-indulgent things, which is a very advanced level. But that's how far that person is capable of taking it. So in a radical break from lifelong attachment to physical gratification, this person disregards all rational considerations and chooses to suffer the pain of death so as not to transgress God's will. His chachma has suddenly woken up from its dormant state and provided him with a surge of faith. So suddenly this person has this enormous faith that shoots forth from him. And he wonders himself, where did this come from? But it's always been there. It's always been there. It just didn't have expression. And now he's giving it expression by bypassing his intellect and just freely expressing his divine, the essence of his soul, which is the chachma part of a person's soul. The arousal of the chachma empowers him to choose God as his portion and his lot, to give up his life for God, to sanctify God's name rather than transgress. Like sometimes we see that that a spouse does something enormously inconvenient for their spouse. Someone does something enormously inconvenient for their spouse. And in many ways, it's irrational. It's like the amount of time, if you calculate it, it wasn't the wise decision. And that's true on a calculated level. It wasn't the wise decision. There's a smarter way we could do it. But the connection that's made through doing that is so profound and deep. It's a connection which is deeper than rationalization. And that has enormous, enormous value that cannot be replaced. So we can find other better ways of doing it economically or to save time, whatever it may be. But there's still something unbelievably profound which cannot be replaced by the selfless dedication of this person to their spouse. And this is the exact same way with God. Let's do a little more here, and then we'll open up for questions, if there are any. For even though, bottom of page 227, for even though the Klippas had prevailed over him all his life, and like an addict, he had been powerless against them. He was never able to find a way in his irrational self and his emotional self to overcome himself. As our rabbis of blessed memory taught, that the Risham are controlled by their hearts. That when a person behaves so repeatedly in a self-oriented fashion, they almost become a victim of their own selves. Nevertheless, when it comes to an unambiguous test of his faith in the one God, where God gives him a test which is so black and white that there's very little room for rationalization, a faith which even in Risham, even in wicked people, has its foundation in the holy peaks. This, referring to divine soul's component of Chachma, in which the blessed infinite light is present, Then as soon as his chachma awakens, all the klippas are rendered null and void. In a single moment, the essence of the person is awakened and everything else is non-existent. It's a very, very powerful experience. Once chachma and its divine light flood through the other parts of the soul, all the klippas are rendered instantaneously powerless. This is because klippa can only function under the illusion of fragmentation. And as soon as chachma brings to light the fundamental unity of the universe, and that is the presence of God, all klippas are paralyzed. The point is, we're gonna stop here for today. When we experience someone doing a selfless act for us, that we know is a selfless act, and we know that it even cost them. You know when someone does you a favor and it costs them money? And you almost wonder, like, why did you do that? You know, or we feel bad. Why are you spending money doing this? Or it costs them time, an enormous amount of time, and they just sacrifice their time. There's something that's created in that moment. There's a beauty that we experience in the world through this person, which is just unbelievably special. And when we do an act which is really selfless, where we really give of ourselves irrational, I like to use the word super rationally because it's not irrational, it's super rational, where we really give of our time and our resources in order to just be there for another person, where there's nothing we're getting back from them. There's no benefit. It's just purely for them. The feeling that we have of the fact, and that feeling comes from the fact that we are in some way aware that I've just liberated myself from myself. Because I just did something that had nothing to do with self. It's so powerful. And ideally, we strive that more and more of our life should be lived this way. It's scary. You know, we're scared and we're worried. Like, what's going to happen to myself? But actually, it is the most beautiful way to live. And that all comes from the chachma of our soul. And that is always there and available to us. It can never get quieted or shut down. So we conclude here for today. I'm open for questions. If anyone needs to go, you can. If you heard enough. And if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask. We'll have a few minutes of questions. By the way, let me ask you a question. Was the video, you can do, I guess, a nod of heads if you'd like. Was the video, the actual video, just a moment here.